Hello students, welcome to the MOOC course on Political Economy 2. The topic for our discussion today is economic imperialism. Imperialism, as you already know, is connotative of a relationship between domination and subjugation. Domination that is exercised by a more powerful country over one that is relatively less powerful or advanced. Modern political scientists in general and Marxist scholars in particular consider that it is an economic interest which lies at the root of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution in England led to an abundance of production. The mercantile classes at this historical juncture were also advantaged by the discovery of various trade routes. So when there was overproduction at home, there was need to ensure that this excess production could be siphoned off to other places, and that is how these European countries went out in their search for new markets, and they discovered different places in Africa, Asia, and Latin America over which they clamped colonial rule. And that is how these colonies became agricultural appendages of the metropolitan centers, serving a twofold purpose. One, they were also areas where raw materials could be grown to feed the industries of the European countries at home, and they could also be used, secondly, as a market for finished products that were churned out by the European factories. Lenin attempted to demonstrate in his idea of imperialism that capitalism was to stabilize itself temporarily through the imperialist penetration of the underdeveloped countries. Such penetration, Lenin argued, follows the concept of appropriating cheap labor and resources from these countries and hence are able to realize super abnormal profits. These profits, in turn, are used to raise the wages of key elements of the industrial working class and to dampen their revolutionary fervor. Economic imperialism, therefore, basically meant that capitalism was becoming a worldwide phenomenon, as Marx had predicted. And in the long run, the Third World itself became an industrialized and competitive component of the larger capitalist system. So, how does imperialism, or rather economic imperialism, explain the phenomenon of world wars? I just told you at the outset that all these European countries were in their search for colonies because there was excess production at home which had to be marketed to different places in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So all these European countries basically ended up in quarrelsome relationships in their quest for more and more colonies. And therefore, world wars are nothing but imperialist wars. Imperialism is the stage at which finance capital has seized and dominated the whole world, and indeed the imperialist interests have begun to quarrel. And this was the basic cause of both the world wars that the world has witnessed. You see, let us look at it this way. Imperialism is the mother concept, as I said, which connotes a relationship of domination and subjugation. Imperialism manifested itself in earlier times in colonialism. I told you how the European countries, in their search for new markets, clamped colonial rule in different parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So colonialism definitely offered the imperialist powers a credible ground through which their profits could be sustained. They converted these colonies into areas for growing raw materials for their industries at home, and these were also areas which served as markets once the finished products were ready to be dished out. But although colonialism is a form of imperialism, we also know that colonialism ultimately could not endure beyond the world wars. Why? Because the world wars had devastated the European countries and they were therefore not in a position to maintain colonies. And that is how the colonies acquired independence in the aftermath of the Second World War. We are familiar with the Indian case. India became independent in 1947. But it is not that these colonial powers were too happy or too willing to give independence to their colonies. It was simply a question of inaffordability. And because they were all faced with the task of domestic reconstruction, all these European countries had to give independence to their colonies and retreat into their shells. But deep down in their hearts, they were too eager to renew the relationship of domination and subjugation between metropolitan center and colony, because the colony was such an important source of wealth that sustained the colonial empires of the erstwhile European metropolitan centers. Neocolonialism is another form of imperialism. In other words, in addressing the question whether imperialism is synonymous with colonialism, we understand that colonialism is one form of imperialism, but imperialism can have other forms. Neocolonialism is the other form of imperialism that we shall talk about. You see, colonialism could not endure in a world after the Second World War, because, as I said, the world wars had ravaged the European countries. They could not maintain colonies anymore. But after the Second World War, the relationship of domination and subjugation was renewed through extremely surreptitious and skillful techniques by the erstwhile colonial masters. Neocolonialism, as the term itself suggests, is a new form of colonialism. Neo as in new. And the newness consists in the fact that although these countries are formally sovereign and independent states, they continue to be dominated and manipulated by the erstwhile colonial masters through extremely subtle, surreptitious techniques which operate in extremely covered and covert ways. In other words, the newness of neocolonialism consists in the fact that all these countries are formally, politically sovereign and independent states. But that is just a facade. Behind that facade of sovereignty and political independence, they continue to be manipulated through subtle and surreptitious techniques. And that is why we say that neocolonialism is basically a new form of colonialism which operates in a world where formally the metropolitan centers are not in possession of any kind of colonies or colonial wealth. But what are the specific factors, interestingly, which led to the emergence of this new phenomenon called neocolonialism? In order to answer this question, friends, we have to understand that the world in the aftermath of the Second World War exhibited certain interesting features to which I would like to draw your attention to. First, you have the emergence of the Third World, all those black spots that became discernible in the world map as a result of the retreat of colonialism, which we have just spoken about. Second, the emergence of the People's Republic of China is an interesting event at this juncture, because socialism was no longer, although socialism, had happened for the first time in the erstwhile Soviet Union, it was often considered as some kind of a magical event which could not be replicated ever again in history. But the emergence of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, convinced people that socialism could emerge again and again. And that is why the prospects of ushering in socialism in their countries rankled heavily with the third world countries, which had suffered from the heavy hand of colonial exploitation. And that is why the prospects of socialism as a global ideology was considerably whetted by the emergence of the People's Republic of China. The third factor is the de-Europeanization of world politics as a result of the end of colonies. And you also find that at this juncture, USA emerges. I mean, in fact, there is the emergence of two major superpowers. In this case, most notably, I would refer to the emergence of the USA as a global power, as a superpower, because USA gradually, which has been following for a long time the policy of isolationism, now keeps coveting a global role. And it is also looked upon as some kind of a kind uncle by the newly independent countries of Africa and Asia and Latin America, because don't forget that USA itself was at one time a colony of Great Britain. So it was considered to be the champion of the democratic world and someone to whom all countries could look up to for aid and assistance, both the war-ravaged economies of Western Europe as well as the third world countries. So what are the specific factors which propelled neocolonialism into the center stage? First, the economic factor. You see, all these newly independent countries of the third world, they were, of course, happy to have their independence, but they could not obviously feed and fatten themselves on their newfound independence. They needed something more tangible. And the only resource which they really were abundant in was manpower. But they did not have any technological development. And that is why, for technological aid and assistance, they had to look up to their erstwhile colonial masters, who of course agreed to help, but not gratis. So there was a trade-off. And in return for technological assistance which the erstwhile colonial masters offered to the third world countries, the third world countries had to give them their markets. And that gave the opportunity to the metropolitan centers, the erstwhile metropolitan centers, to make inroads into the third world once again. The ideological factor. I have already referred to the birth of the People's Republic of China, which buttressed the prospects of socialism as a global ideology. So basically, the imperialist powers were faced with the challenge of containing the domain of capitalism. And this they were able to do by thinking up an extremely skillful pattern of investment which they promoted in different parts of the third world. So you will find that there were various countries of the third world, like, say, for instance, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So many of these countries were flooded with consumer goods. So by promoting a policy of cheap consumerism, by sponsoring a policy of consumerism throughout the third world, the advanced imperialist countries succeeded in containing the zone of socialism, and capitalism therefore was able to win the victory ideologically. The last factor which I would like to draw your attention to is the political factor, and you will note that although there were ideological struggles waged in all these third world countries for independence, the leaders of these movements, take a typical case like Jawaharlal Nehru, who comes from the socio-economic elite. And it is these elements which were utilized by the neocolonial powers. How? You see, all these people in the third world, the socio-economic elite, even the bureaucratic elite, they were all bred in an attitude of softness towards the West. So when they emerged as the policymakers and the policy implementers of their independent countries, they obviously would set targets for their countries which would verge on things like westernization, urbanization, development, all of which would require them to seek the help of the West. And in seeking the help of the West, you have come back to the economic point, which is they would indulge in a trade-off between the markets which they would offer and the technological assistance which they would need to solicit from the metropolitan centers. So we find that there is retreat of old-style colonialism, and that actually starts vanishing because of a combination of three factors in the international scene to which I have already drawn your attention to. First, the emergence of the third world. Second, the emergence of socialist countries. And third, the national liberation movements in the colonial world. So neocolonialism, therefore, rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the funeral pyre of colonialism. the interesting question at this stage is, how does economic imperialism operate in an age without colonies? How does the domination of the third world happen in a world when they are actually sovereign independent states? With respect to economic domination, I will draw your attention to two major instruments. One, the multinational corporations, and the other, Western aid. Now, multinational corporations are basically giant private economic agents which operate extensively throughout the world with production facilities in several countries, and their annual turnovers easily run into millions of dollars, billions of dollars in fact, which easily overtakes the GNP of many a third world country. But these multinational corporations have a fundamental difference with earlier multinational corporations. First, in the past, companies that did business in several countries were headquartered in one state, and all or most of the production was centered there. This has changed. Today, if a country wants to sell its product, it may set up a subsidiary for manufacture there. Second, there are many of these companies, and the ones involved on an international scale have dramatically increased the number of the subsidiaries. So basically, multinational corporations have today created for themselves a worldwide empire over which the sun does not seem to ever set. And third, MNCs have become so visible is that they have become spectacularly successful. And because of the tremendous financial clout which they enjoy, they are able to mobilize resources, huge resources, from one end of the planet to the other, almost at the flick of a switch. And that allows them to dominate extensively throughout the world, particularly throughout the third world. And they have started operating extensively throughout the third world mainly because of two factors. One, the tremendous population of the third world provides them with huge markets, which is an important and perhaps an undeniable lure. And also, the widespread illiteracy throughout the third world, by and large, makes the third world much more gullible to the influence of the products which are dished out by the multinational corporations. But what is to be noted is that these multinational corporations receive the backing of the parent countries, which stylize themselves as welfare states, and to fund their various welfare activities, they need the support of the profits, at least a part of the profits that are reaped by the multinational corporations, which is the main reason why the backing is provided. And we have therefore seen that these multinational corporations have started operating extensively throughout the third world, primarily because, number one, they receive tremendous backing from the parent country. And they, in particular, take advantage of various pieces of legislation that are enacted in the legislatures of their parent countries. I can, for example, cite the case of the Trading with the Enemy Act or the Hickenlooper Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, both passed by the US Congress, which actually opened up the domain of operation of the multinational corporations by basically clarifying that countries which are not favorably disposed to the USA will not be provided with the kind of support that they might be otherwise looking for in terms of financial and technological assistance. We have seen that multinational corporations take advantage of different pieces of legislation enacted by the legislatures of their parent countries. But the parent countries also use multinational corporations as instruments of intelligence gathering. That is because the imperialist powers want to ensure that no kind of move towards any radicalism happens in the third world country. And in order to ensure that, they have to keep a keen watch over all kinds of political developments in the third world. And in this context, multinational corporations serve as important instruments of information gathering or fact-finding throughout the third world. Multinational corporations also are used as important instruments to influence domestic policy making of the third world countries. It usually happens this way, that particular political parties are given aid by the multinational corporations before elections. So when after elections a particular party forms the government, it will naturally feel obligated and would want to reciprocate the good gesture of the multinational corporation by coming up with measures that are basically required by the Western imperialist powers. And this is visible in countries throughout the third world, particularly in India, where we can find that multinational corporations use their own parent country's resources to support political parties of their choice. But while the influence that is exerted in the field of domestic policy is clear and discernible, the pattern is not so obvious or similar with respect to foreign policy. But even in case of foreign policy, please understand that the influence is no less. In case of Indo-Pak relations, for instance, we find that although India has been able to mend her fences with several other neighbors and maintain proper diplomatic ties and relations with countries across the world, somehow Indo-Pak relations has always remained a sour note in India's relations with foreign countries. And to a large extent today, scholars would like to pin the blame on multinational corporations who have always tried to orchestrate in Pakistan some kind of a mindset that any prospect of or any talk about proposed improvement of relations between the two countries is basically a ploy on part of India to ensure that Pakistan falls into India's trap. And that is how improvement of relations have never happened between these two particular countries. And although the story changes from time to time from one country to another, the fact remains that foreign policy is also a domain which is not free from the encroachment by the multinational corporations. Apart from this, the multinational corporations, I would also like to draw your attention to the whole concept of Western aid. You know, there is something quite misleading about the term aid itself, because aid generally is connotative of some kind of help. But that is far from what we see in the case of Western aid, because what happens is basically that the country is given a loan which has to be repaid with interest. And the country has to fulfill various conditions in order to be able to receive aid. And not only does it receive aid, once it has received aid, conditions are also stipulated by the donor countries or by the donor organizations that the country is to spend the money in such and such ways. All of which basically try to ensure that a particular third world country is not able to spend its aid in the direction that will help her to attain self-sufficiency. The whole idea is very clear, that the country must continue to remain dependent on the West, because that is what will actually fill the coffers of the Western imperialist powers. And that is why it is important to understand that aid is never aid without strings. In fact, it is this conditionality of aid which needs to be always brought in mind and kept in focus when one wants to understand the nature of imperialism in contemporary times. A major consequence of aid is also the displacement of priorities. The third world is teeming with problems like poverty, illiteracy, income inequality, malnutrition. But what happens is, in all these countries, because of the promotion of consumerism, a consumerist culture gradually starts to build up, which is, of course, to a large extent the handiwork of multinational corporations and the tremendous investment they make with regard to investments in mass media and advertisements. But all of that goes to create a consumerist culture, which leads to displacement of priorities because people turn more and more consumerist. So historically, they are willing to compromise on things like education and nutrition and invest on consumerism and indulge in consumerist culture, which of course is historically not a priority for them. And as a result of all this, the third world countries inevitably fall into the debt trap. I told you at the very outset that the concept of aid is misleading because it is a loan which has to be repaid with interest. And now I will clarify why it is a trap. You see, once a country receives aid, it basically falls into a trap which is like a vicious circle, which reduces the recipient country almost to the level of a bonded laborer. To come out of the debt trap, the country must generate real income growth. But this is not possible without the public sector, which again, by the very condition of the aid, I told you about the conditionality of the aid, the public sector is increasingly relegated to a negligible role. And again, aid is invariably given to a country which is politically and ideologically soft and sympathetic to the donor country. A major consequence of foreign aid is thus political destabilization, which is intended to place right-wing military dictatorships who are predisposed to function as pliant tools in the hands of the imperialist powers. So economic imperialism therefore survives in a world without colonies, mainly with the instrumentalities of multinational corporations and Western aid. Western aid is basically a loan which the country is unable to repay. So because it is a loan which has to be repaid, the country very soon realizes that it will have to borrow again, and this time much of that aid goes into the repayment of the first loan. So you go on paying and repaying in an endless cycle, and that is what is generally referred to as a debt trap. It is almost as if the country is running on a conveyor belt. It has to run faster and faster, faster and faster, just to stay at the same place. The IMF programs perpetuate, this is just an illustration of how conditionality of aid affects and impacts the third world in the long run. The IMF programs perpetuate the colonial economic pattern, and aid can never be fully paid back. Aid brings them, of course, temporary relief, which is, of course, the lure in getting aid for immediate payment difficulties, but ultimately they are thrown back into the very economic pattern they were trying to escape from. And this is basically how imperialism continues to survive in an age where there are no colonies. Remember, imperialism manifested itself in earlier times in the form of colonies, in the form of colonialism. That has undergone a metamorphosis in today's world, where we find a new kind of imperialism in vogue, that is neocolonialism. But although we have entered upon an age where the erstwhile metropolitan centers do not have colonies or colonial wealth in that sense, colonialism has ended. There are no colonies that are visible. Most countries of the third world are formally independent and sovereign states, yet the same story of domination and subjugation for purposes of economic exploitation continues, and that is what lies at the heart of the entire story of imperialism. Thank you.